The wind across the Norman countryside carried the smell of burned fuel and wet earth on the morning of August 8th, 1944. Low clouds hung over the fields near Villers-Bocage, and the narrow roads were still scarred by the fighting that had raged across Normandy for 2 months. In the distance, the rumble
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.
of tank engines rolled across the hedgerows like distant thunder. Inside one British tank, the crew sat in silence, listening carefully. They knew German armor was close. Somewhere out there were Panther tanks, the pride of the German Panzer divisions, machines built to destroy anything the Allies could field. Yet within the next few hours, something strange would happen. German crews would begin reporting something they almost could not believe. A British Cromwell tank, lighter, faster, and supposedly weaker, was somehow slipping through their lines and outmaneuvering them. For a moment in that deadly summer, the hunters were becoming the hunted. You can almost feel the tension inside that Cromwell. The metal hull vibrates gently from the engine. The crew breathes quietly in the cramped space. Outside, the countryside looks calm, but every hedgerow could hide a gun barrel. The British crew knows one thing very well. If they meet a Panther head-on, they will likely lose. The Panther's 75mm KWK 42 gun can destroy a Cromwell from well over 1,000 meters. The Cromwell's own 75mm gun is far less powerful. On paper, the fight is not even close. But war on paper and war in the field are two very different things. By the summer of 1944, the German army was fighting desperately to hold Normandy. After the Allied landings on June 6, 1944, thousands of British, American, and Canadian soldiers pushed inland from the beaches. The German command rushed its armored divisions into the battle, including units equipped with the feared Panther tank. The Panther had first appeared in 1943 during the Battle of Kursk, and it quickly earned a reputation as one of the most dangerous tanks of the war. Its thick, sloped armor and high-velocity gun allowed it to knock out Allied tanks before they even came close. German tank crews trusted the Panther. They respected it. Many believed it was simply superior. But Normandy was not the open plains of Eastern Europe. Normandy was a maze. The countryside was divided by thick hedgerows known as bocage. These hedges were not small bushes. Many were several meters tall and packed with trees, roots, and dense soil. Tanks could not easily drive through them. Instead, they were forced onto narrow lanes and small openings between fields. Visibility was poor. A tank might turn a corner and suddenly find an enemy only 50 meters away. In that kind of environment, speed and awareness mattered just as much as armor. The British Cromwell tank, introduced in 1944, was designed with speed in mind. Powered by the Rolls-Royce Meteor engine, which was based on the famous Merlin aircraft engine, the Cromwell could reach speeds of around 40 miles per hour on roads. That made it one of the fastest tanks in the war. Inside, its crew of 5 worked closely together. The commander scanned the battlefield, the gunner tracked targets, the loader prepared shells, the driver handled the narrow lanes, and the radio operator stayed in contact with other tanks. The Cromwell was not heavily armored compared to the Panther. Its frontal armor was about 76 millimeters at best, while the Panther's sloped armor created far thicker protection. But the Cromwell had something the Panther did not always have in the tight Norman countryside: agility. Before many Cromwell crews ever faced German Panthers, they had trained intensely in England for months. British armored doctrine had already learned hard lessons earlier in the war in North Africa and Italy. Tank crews were taught that awareness and coordination could be more important than brute strength. A Cromwell crew drilled constantly on communication. The commander had to give clear orders. The driver had to react instantly. The gunner had to aim and fire within seconds. Inside a tank, every crew member depended completely on the others. And once the hatch closed, those 5 men became a single fighting machine. On the morning of August 8th, during the opening phase of Operation Totalize, British armored units pushed south toward Falaise. The operation aimed to break through German defenses and trap large parts of the German army in Normandy. Among the British forces advancing were units equipped with Cromwell tanks from formations like the 11th Armored Division and elements of the Guards Armored Division. German resistance was fierce. Units of the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, and Panzer Lehr Division still held strong defensive positions. Their Panthers waited behind hedgerows, hulls hidden, guns aimed down narrow roads. For many British crews, encountering a Panther meant extreme danger. But one Cromwell crew was about to turn the situation upside down. Inside that tank sat a British commander who had learned quickly in Normandy that survival depended on movement. Standing still was deadly. Predictable movement was deadly. Panthers were powerful, but they relied on long-range advantage and careful positioning. If you took that advantage away, things changed. The Cromwell moved along a narrow farm lane, its tracks grinding softly over dirt and loose stones. The driver kept the speed steady, careful not to expose the tank too early. The commander peered through his periscope, scanning the hedgerows. Then suddenly, the gunner spotted something. A Panther. The German tank sat partially hidden behind a hedgerow gap, roughly 600 meters away. Its long barrel pointed toward the road. The Panther crew likely believed they had the perfect ambush position. Any Allied tank appearing in front of them would be destroyed in seconds. But the Cromwell commander saw the threat just in time. Instead of advancing into the Panther's sights, the Cromwell reversed quickly behind a hedge and disappeared from view. Inside the Panther, the German commander waited. Seconds passed, then a minute. Nothing appeared. The Panther's gunner kept the sights trained on the road. The commander scanned the fields. They knew Allied tanks were nearby. But the target they expected simply vanished. What they did not realize was that the Cromwell had already moved. Using a small farm path hidden behind the hedgerows, the British driver accelerated. The Meteor engine roared as the tank raced along a narrow route that the Panther crew could not see. The Cromwell's smaller size allowed it to slip through tight turns and small gaps. Within minutes, the Cromwell emerged on the flank of the German position. The Panther's armor was strongest in the front, but on the sides it was far weaker. At roughly 300 meters, the Cromwell stopped briefly. The gunner lined up the shot. A 75-millimeter armor-piercing shell fired with a sharp blast. The round slammed into the Panther's side armor. Inside the German tank, sparks and metal fragments exploded through the fighting compartment. The crew reacted instantly, trying to return fire, but the angle was wrong. Before the Panther could rotate its turret fully, the Cromwell fired again. The second shell struck near the engine compartment. Thick black smoke began pouring from the German tank. For the Panther crew, it was a shocking moment. Panthers were used to dominating British tanks at long range, but here a Cromwell had slipped around them and struck from the side before they could react. And that moment was not unique. Across Normandy during the summer of 1944, British tank crews learned quickly that fighting Panthers required creativity. The Cromwell was never meant to fight heavy German tanks head-on. Instead, British doctrine emphasized cooperation between tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support. Cromwells often worked alongside Sherman Firefly tanks, which carried the powerful 17-pounder gun capable of destroying Panthers from distance. But when Fireflies were not immediately available, Cromwell crews relied on speed and positioning. German crews began reporting strange encounters. British tanks appeared in unexpected places. They moved faster than expected. They vanished behind hedgerows and reappeared on the flank. Panther crews trusted their armor and gun, but those advantages depended on controlling the engagement. In the tight maze of Normandy, control was difficult. British reconnaissance units played a key role in this. Cromwells were frequently used in reconnaissance regiments, such as the Household Cavalry Regiment. Their job was to probe German defenses, find weak points, and move quickly through gaps. A Panther crew might think they were watching one road, only to discover British armor approaching from another direction entirely. One British officer later wrote that Normandy tank combat felt like hunting in a forest where every tree might hide a gun. For German tank commanders trained on the open battlefields of Eastern Europe, the experience was frustrating. Their Panthers were powerful, but the terrain limited their strengths. Meanwhile, the Cromwell's speed allowed British units to exploit small openings in the line. The Meteor engine, producing over 600 horsepower, gave the Cromwell rapid acceleration. On narrow lanes between hedgerows, that speed meant a Cromwell could reposition faster than a Panther could rotate its turret or change direction. The Panther weighed nearly 45 tons. The Cromwell weighed closer to 28 tons. That difference mattered on small farm roads and soft ground. German crews began encountering Cromwells appearing suddenly on their flanks or rear. Sometimes the British tanks would not even stop to fight directly. Instead, they would move past German positions, calling in artillery or guiding other units forward. The battlefield became a chess match. One move followed another: speed against firepower, mobility against armor. On several occasions, German reports mentioned British tanks maneuvering aggressively in ways that surprised Panther crews. The Cromwell's ability to rapidly change direction and relocate made it harder for German gunners to establish stable firing positions. And then there was the psychological factor. Panther crews expected to dominate. When that expectation failed, confusion followed. In one after-action report from late July 1944, German officers described Allied tanks appearing unexpectedly behind defensive positions, forcing Panther crews to reposition under pressure. Each movement exposed their weaker side armor. Each delay gave the British another chance. Meanwhile, Allied air power added even more pressure. And German tank crews in Normandy constantly worried about Hawker Typhoon fighter bombers armed with rockets. Even if a Panther survived a ground fight, air attacks could arrive within minutes. This forced German armor to move carefully and often hide during daylight. British Cromwell units took advantage of that hesitation. They moved quickly, probing, testing, and exploiting any weakness they found. The reality of tank combat in Normandy was also brutally close. In many cases, opposing tanks encountered each other at distances under 500 meters. At those ranges, reaction time became everything. The commander had to identify the enemy instantly. The gunner had to fire quickly and accurately. Even a few seconds of hesitation could mean destruction. Cromwell crews trained themselves to react almost automatically. The commander called the target. The turret turned. The gun fired. And if the shot did not destroy the enemy tank immediately, the Cromwell would move again before the enemy could respond. For the crew of that Cromwell on August 8th, the moment after the Panther began burning was brief. The commander did not celebrate. He knew there were more German tanks nearby. The driver immediately accelerated again. The tank disappeared behind another hedgerow. Moments later, German artillery shells began crashing into the field where the Panther burned. But the Cromwell was already gone. That was the key. Survive the encounter. Strike quickly, then move, again and again. Over the next weeks, battles around Caen, Falaise, and the closing of the Falaise pocket saw intense armored combat. Panthers remained dangerous opponents, and many British tanks were destroyed in these battles. But the Cromwell proved something important. A tank did not need the thickest armor or the biggest gun to influence the battlefield. It needed mobility, it needed a trained crew, and it needed commanders willing to adapt. British tank crews learned to use the terrain, coordinate with infantry, and strike where German armor was vulnerable. By mid-August 1944, German forces in Normandy began collapsing under pressure from multiple directions. The closing of the Falaise pocket trapped large parts of the German army. Thousands of vehicles were destroyed or abandoned during the retreat. Among the wrecks scattered across the fields were Panthers, Shermans, Cromwells, half-tracks, and trucks from both sides. Each burned hull told a story. Some were destroyed by artillery, some by aircraft. Some by tank battles fought at incredibly close range, and sometimes the story involved a fast British Cromwell slipping through the hedgerows and striking where the enemy least expected it. Inside those Cromwells were crews who understood the risks. They knew the Panther was powerful, they respected it, but they also knew something the Panther crews sometimes forgot. In war, the strongest weapon is not always the heaviest machine. Sometimes it is the ability to think faster than the enemy, to move faster, to adapt faster. And on certain days in Normandy, German Panther crews looked through their sights expecting an easy target. Instead, they saw something racing through the hedgerows, appearing where no tank should have been, a Cromwell. And by the time they reacted, it was already behind them.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.